Imagine taking the Mona Lisa out of the Louvre, just ripping it out of its protective, climate-controlled frame and gluing it to the cinder block wall of a fluorescent-lit gas station bathroom.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That is quite the visual to start with.
Right. I mean, structurally, it is the exact same arrangement of paint on canvas.
Hmm.
But the experience of looking at it, the meaning you derive from it, the emotional weight of it, it would feel entirely different.
Because context changes everything. It really does.
Exactly. Context changes everything. Yeah, and the mission here, just to be clear, is not to teach you how to hold a pencil or, render a perfect shadow.
No, not at all. It is actually a masterclass in observation. It's about rewiring your brain to actually see the spaces you walk through every single day.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when most of us look at a building, or, when an architecture student first tries to draw one, we tend to treat it like a perfectly detailed object just sort of floating in a white void.
Just an isolated collection of walls and a roof.
Yeah, exactly. Just this pristine thing with no background.
Which is a complete illusion. I mean, the foundational argument we're exploring today is that context is never just a background condition.
Right.
It isn't a nice little decorative frame you put around a structure to make the picture look pretty. Context is a fundamental part of architectural meaning.
So a building simply cannot exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. It derives its scale, its character, its entire identity from whatever surrounds it.
That actually brings up a great mental exercise. Picture a solitary chapel sitting perfectly alone on top of a grassy hill.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. The architectural experience of that building is defined by the long approach, the sheer isolation of the structure, its crisp silhouette against the sky.
Yeah, you feel the quietness of it.
Exactly. Now mentally pick up that exact same chapel and wedge it into a dense, crowded city block right between a pizza shop and a massive skyscraper.
The geometry of the chapel hasn't changed by a single inch, but it is fundamentally a different building.
But okay, let me push back on this a little bit, because there is this myth of the floating object, right? The idea that beautiful design is universal.
Sure, yeah.
If I see a gorgeous, ornate Victorian house, isn't it gorgeous whether it's surrounded by an ancient forest or just plopped in the middle of a concrete parking lot?
Well, what's fascinating here is that, yes, it might retain its aesthetic geometry, but the emotional response it triggers completely shifts.
Really? Just from the parking lot?
Absolutely. The same exact wall can feel monumental and imposing, or incredibly modest and fragile, depending entirely on the adjacent structure.
Amazing.
Without context, a building becomes a detached artifact. It's like a museum piece in a glass case.
Right.
But when you factor in the surroundings, the text calls it a situated intervention.
A situated intervention. That implies the building is actively doing something to the space, like it's negotiating with it.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanism behind why that happens. Take a house that feels incredibly sheltered, safe and cozy.
Yeah, I'm picturing like a cottage.
Right. The house itself isn't generating all of that feeling. Our brains perceive that coziness because of the mature trees wrapping around it, or maybe a terraced garden that buffers it from the street.
Or like a little white picket fence.
Exactly. Or the fact that it sits in a slight topographic depression in the land. The environment is creating the emotion.
And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, think about a massive civic building, like a courthouse or a city hall.
Oh, yeah. Very different vibe.
Those buildings feel imposing and dripping with authority. But it's not just because they have big columns. It's often because of the massive, wide-open plaza placed right in front of them.
Right. The sheer emptiness of that plaza does the heavy lifting.
Yes. It isolates the building and forces you to cross a void to reach it, which makes you feel small.
So context isn't supplementary. It is constitutive. It literally makes the architecture what it is.
So if a building is entirely defined by its setting, the absolute most fundamental point of contact has to be where the architecture literally meets the earth.
The ground plane.
Yeah, the ground plane. We spend so much time walking around cities, looking up at the tops of skyscrapers, totally forgetting to look down at the ground.
And the ground plane is where the illusion of the floating object shatters. But sight in architecture means so much more than just the dirt a building sits on.
What else does it include?
It is an entire network of conditions. We're talking about the topography, the orientation to the sun, the climate, the vegetation.
Wow, okay.
And even the historical or cultural memory embedded in that specific plot of land.
And visually, if you don't anchor a building to those ground conditions, the slopes, the steps, the pavements, the retaining edges, your brain can't make sense of its gravity. It looks like it's magically hovering.
Exactly. How a building touches the earth dictates our psychological read of its permanence. Think about a modern building raised up on pilatus.
Wait, pilatus, what are those?
Oh, they're those slender, exposed columns that lift the main structure off the ground so you can actually walk underneath it.
Oh, right, like a lot of mid-century modern stuff.
Exactly. The brain registers that thinness and openness as light, almost temporary. Now compare that to a massive stone library resting on a heavy, solid plinth that runs deep into the dirt.
Your brain reads that thickness as rooted, immovable, and permanent.
Yes, precisely.
Or take a house that steps down a steep hillside. You literally cannot understand the physical shape of that house unless you read it through the changes in the ground level. Every floor is a reaction to the dirt.
Right, it's conforming to the landscape.
And this actually ties back beautifully to what you were saying about courthouses and plazas. There is a concept called ceremonial distance.
Oh, that's a great concept.
Yeah, setting a public building behind a broad, sweeping staircase forces you to physically ascend to enter. It demands effort. It elevates the institution above the individual.
Contrast that with the local bakery or, say, a corner shop where the door opens completely flush with the pavement.
Right, there's zero ceremonial distance there.
Exactly, you don't have to ascend. Because of that direct ground plane connection, the shop instantly becomes a democratic part of the everyday street life.
Which proves the landscape is never just the opposite of architecture, We constantly pit them against each other, the built environment versus nature, but they're partners.
They are deeply intertwined. If we connect this to the bigger picture, trees and terrain aren't just decorative filler. They interact with the structure in ways that change its physical properties.
Like how?
Well, a glass pavilion built next to a quiet lake isn't just sitting next to water. The water reflects the pavilion, doubling its visual presence and adding an entirely new spatial dimension.
Oh, that makes sense.
Or consider a heavy stone structure built right into rugged, rocky terrain. It stops looking like a functional shelter and starts feeling geologically rooted.
Like the building itself just grew out of the cliff face.
Exactly.
So we've firmly grounded our imaginary building in nature, in the topography, the dirt, and the water. But let's be real, a lot of us, listening right now, we are not living our daily lives next to serene lakes and jagged cliffs.
No, definitely not. Most of us are in cities and suburbs.
Right. So what happens when the context isn't a quiet landscape, but a chaotic, noisy, densely packed urban street?
The rules of engagement completely change, because in urban areas, buildings are shaped by the collective fabric of the city. A streetscape is a continuous visual sequence.
It has a rhythm.
Yes, it has rhythm, it has repetition, and it has sudden, jarring interruptions.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Think of an urban street like a massive run-on sentence.
Okay, I like that analogy.
If you just have word after word after word with no punctuation, your brain gets exhausted. There's nowhere to breathe. The architecture provides the punctuation.
So you can't just focus on one word, one building, and ignore the rest of the sentence.
Exactly. You have to see how that main building is continuing the thought of the structures next to it, or how it's acting like a giant exclamation point that disrupts the whole block. But how does sketching the neighbors actually change how we see the main building?
Well, the mechanism that makes that disruption or harmony visible is scale. And scale is entirely relative. It only becomes legible to the human eye through comparison.
Right.
If you are analyzing a target building, you have to look at the neighbors. The setbacks from the street, the roof lines, those elements immediately reveal whether your building is a dominant force, a modest background player, or a transitional piece.
Like bridging a towering financial district with a low-rise residential neighborhood.
Yes, let's visualize this. Think about a narrow brick terrace house, a neighborhood pub on the corner, and a massive glass office tower.
Okay, got it.
They're all participating in the exact same urban context, but their scale dictates their role.
Yeah, if you place a historic church tower right next to a row of single-story homes, that tower is commanding. It dictates the skyline.
But take that exact same church tower and wedge it between two 70-story glass office blocks, suddenly the tower looks fragile.
It looks dwarfed.
It feels like a stubborn historical relic fighting to hold its ground against modernization.
This is why it is so crucial to read the specific visual cues of the urban fabric. And there are some great technical terms for this that actually make a lot of intuitive sense once you break them down, like cornice lines.
Oh, cornice lines are huge in urban sketching.
Yeah, a cornice is that decorative horizontal molding you often see running along the top edge of older buildings. When several buildings on a street have cornice lines at the exact same height, it creates a visual equator.
Your eye just naturally glides down the street along that line.
Right, and when a new building pops up and breaks that line, it acts like a visual speed bump.
Another crucial cue is base spacing. This is the rhythm of the vertical elements, how far apart the windows or the columns are placed.
So if a whole block has closely spaced, narrow windows, it creates a fast staccato beat.
Yes, and if a modern building drops in with a massive, unbroken wall of glass, it completely disrupts the musical rhythm of the street.
You also have to look at the proportions of the shop fronts and even the heights of the awnings hanging over the sidewalks.
Wow, because when you start noticing these things, you stop seeing a city as a bunch of isolated landmarks shouting for attention.
You start seeing a collective composition.
Exactly. But an urban composition isn't just made of concrete, glass, and steel. A streetscape is essentially a ghost town until you introduce friction and movement.
So the city isn't just empty concrete shells. It's alive, shifting with the weather and swarming with people.
Yes.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
Because if my goal is to document the physical architecture of a space, aren't people, rain clouds, and weather just distracting noise? Shouldn't a pure architectural study focus strictly on the geometry of the building?
This raises an important question. That assumes architecture is just a math equation. But a math equation doesn't mean anything until a human interacts with it.
I see what you mean.
A doorway's height is just an arbitrary measurement until you see a tall person physically having to duck their head to get inside. Human activity is what reveals the actual social dimension of a context.
Right.
A brilliantly designed, perfectly paved public square is just empty geometry until humans sit in it, walk across it, talk in it, then it becomes a gathering environment.
I think about a porch on the front of a house.
Yeah.
From a pure geometric standpoint, it's just a wooden box projecting off the facade.
Right, just wood and nails.
But the moment you observe someone sitting on it, sipping coffee and waving to a neighbor, the porch transforms. It's no longer a wooden box. It is a threshold for social exchange.
It is the exact boundary where the private sanctuary of the home meets the public theater of the street.
The environment and weather play an equally massive role in how we experience those spaces too.
Oh, absolutely. An architect might design deep, heavy stone arcades over a walkway. If you just look at the shape, you might think it's just an aesthetic choice.
Right.
But when you observe the deep, cool shadows those arcades cast during a blindingly hot summer day, you instantly understand the why behind the architecture. It was built to provide vital refuge from the intense climate.
The passing of seasons changes the physical reality of a building too. Bare, spindly winter trees expose the hard geometric forms of the buildings behind them.
But 6 months later, lush summer foliage might completely obscure those same buildings, softening the entire street.
And weather. Drawing or observing wet pavement after a rainstorm isn't just a romantic flourish.
No, wet concrete actually intensifies the urban mood. It reflects the streetlights and the neon signs, physically doubling the visual intensity of the space.
And you have to factor in the pedestrians, the bicycles chained to the poles, the person reading on a bench.
They provide the ultimate visceral sense of scale. They animate the scene. They remind anyone designing or analyzing a space that buildings are fundamentally vessels meant to be inhabited.
Okay, but let's pause and look at everything we have layered onto our observation. We started with a floating building. Then we anchored it to the ground plane. We factored in the topography and the landscape.
Yeah.
Then we added the entire neighboring streetscape to find its scale. Then we layered on the weather, the lighting, the shadows, the pedestrians, and the bicycles.
It's a lot.
If you try to process all of that at once while walking down the street, or if an artist tries to draw all of it, it is going to be a cluttered, chaotic, overwhelming mess. Our brains cannot process that much reality equally.
Which brings us to the absolute necessity of editing. Making sense of context requires intense selectivity.
So it's an active interpretation.
Exactly. Observation is an active interpretation. You have to make highly deliberate choices about your vantage point. And more importantly, you have to decide what you are going to aggressively ignore.
It is exactly like trying to have a conversation in a packed, noisy restaurant. To hear the person sitting across the table from you, your brain has to actively filter out the clattering plates, the background music, the conversations happening at the next table.
Right, if you don't tune out the noise, you can't hear the story.
Deciding what not to say or focus on is just as important as what you do focus on.
In visual observation, deciding what not to focus on is the only way to make the core architectural relationship legible. The angle you choose to observe from is your first editorial decision.
Right, viewpoint is never neutral.
Exactly. If you stand dead center and look at a building flat on a frontal elevation, you get a very static two-dimensional story.
But if you shift to an oblique view, standing off to the side at a sharp angle, you suddenly see how the facade wraps around the corner.
Yes, you see how deep the window frames are and how the building physically collides with the street.
And when it comes to managing all the visual noise we talked about, there is a brilliant concept in the source text called graphic hierarchy. You don't give every object in your field of vision the same amount of mental or visual weight.
The psychology behind graphic hierarchy relies on how our brains process contrast. High contrast and sharp lines pull an object forward in our perception, demanding attention.
Okay.
Low contrast, soft edges, and lighter textures naturally recede into the background. Your brain categorizes them as distant or less important.
So if you were analyzing a street, the neighboring rooflines might be crucial information to understand the scale of the block, but the 50 individual parked cars lining the curb,
That is visual clutter. You tune them out.
a row of oak trees leading up to an entrance matters because it frames the approach, but drawing every single individual leaf on those oak trees, completely unnecessary data.
Exactly. You use stronger line weights for the main building and lighter treatments for the background elements. By unifying the ground and the shadows into cohesive tones, the main building actually sits inside the environment.
It feels grounded, rather than looking like a high-definition photograph violently pasted onto a blurry background.
This kind of selective editing transforms observation from a passive experience into a profound analytical tool.
Which leads to the final and maybe most impactful layer of this entire philosophy. So what does this all mean? How can drawing a picture, or just observing a street, be an ethical act?
But it's not just about aesthetics. There are real-world stakes. Analyzing a site, noticing the wind arrows, mapping the shadow patterns, spotting the privacy zones eventually reveals a building's ethical responsibility to its environment.
It is unavoidable, because buildings actively alter reality. Every time a new structure goes up, it irreversibly changes the world for everyone around it.
It blocks a view that someone has enjoyed for 20 years.
It casts a permanent shadow over a public park.
It redirects how the winter wind whips down a street. It fundamentally mutates the character of a neighborhood.
Truly observing the context forces us to confront whether a building actually belongs there. And it is so important to clarify that belonging does not just mean blending in.
No, not at all.
It doesn't mean every building has to look exactly like the ones next to it. Belonging can be a highly meaningful, beautifully executed contrast.
Yes, but that contrast only works if it respects the underlying fabric. If a building is grotesquely out of scale, or if its materials are jarring and aggressive.
Or if it presents a blank, hostile concrete wall to the vibrant public sidewalk below it.
Exactly. A deep contextual sketch will instantly expose those tensions. It lays bare the building's failure to respect its surroundings.
And the specific location changes the entire criteria for belonging. In a rural context, you are looking at how a structure relates to the natural landform and the distant horizon lines.
While in a sprawling suburban context, you are analyzing the gaps between houses, the fences, and how far back the homes sit from the street.
But in an urban context, the defining characteristic is scale compression.
Scale compression is that distinct physical sensation of the walls closing in. It is the tight, vertical packing of buildings, the narrow alleys, and the intense density of public movement.
Ultimately, contextual sketching trains the eye to see the place, not just the form. It is a constant, humbling reminder that no project and no idea ever emerges into an empty white void.
It enters a world that is already vibrating with life, history, and deeply established spatial conditions.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started with an isolated hovering geometry.
We anchored it to the dirt.
We let the landscape frame it. We used the neighboring streetscape to define its size.
We layered on the heat of the sun and the reflections of the rain.
We brought in the humans to give it purpose. And we filtered out the noise to find the actual meaning. A building is absolutely nothing without its relationships.
It really isn't.
So for you listening, here's the takeaway. The next time you walk down your street or step out of a train in a new city, don't just look at a building as a shiny, isolated object.
Look at the shadows it casts on the sidewalk. Look at how the trees buffer its entrance.
Look up at the cornice lines and see how the roof negotiates with the buildings next door. Are they harmonizing or are they arguing? Once you tune into the urban conversation happening all around you, you will never be able to unsee it.